Thank you very much, John. It's a pleasure to be here. And I gather if I go to the gallery view, I can see everyone who's present. Hello to all of you, friends and strangers alike. I think what I will do is simply read the first few pages of the book, and Cheryl and I will take it from there. It starts off like this. Die in your prime, and it is tragic. Die in your ninth decade, and it is the debt paid, the quittance. Grief for those struck down too soon goes on and on. We are helplessly haunted by what might have been. A penumbra of vanished possibilities surrounds untimely death. But grief for the elderly is formal, stately. Most of all, it is end-oriented. You roll a boulder across the mouth of the cave. You move on. In The Ghostwriter, Nathan Zuckerman says of Felix Abravanel that the master's charm was a moat so oceanic that you could not even see the great turreted and buttressed thing it had been dug to protect. Philip, too, could seem a beguiling but remote citadel, august, many-towered, lavishly defended. Those who reached the inner keep met there someone quite different from the persona devised for public purposes. Still vitally present at home was the young man he'd remained all along, full of satirical hijinks and gleeful ventriloquisms and antic fun building to crescendos. Imaginary relatives were a specialty. I recall, for example, Paprika Roth, a retired stripper living in the Florida Panhandle. A glint in the eye told you hilarity was on the way. Ben, do you remember when Mrs. Fishbein was on the $64,000 question? A little before my time, Philip. Well, Mrs. Fishbein had walloped the competition. She'd advanced to the $64,000 question itself. Came the drum roll, and the announcer said, for $64,000, Mrs. Fishbein, who was the first man. I wouldn't tell you for $1 million, cried Mrs. Fishbein. The place of origin, Newark's Weequahic section, was his great code and Rosetta Stone. I mean Weequahic as endlessly rediscovered through alchemical imagination, that flame turned up under experience for the smelting of novels. Ours was not a neighborhood steeped in darkness, says Zuckerman in American Pastoral. The place was bright with industriousness. There was a big belief in life, and we were steered relentlessly in the direction of success. A better existence was going to be ours. Am I wrong to think we delighted in living there? No delusions are more familiar than those inspired in the elderly by nostalgia. But am I completely mistaken to think that living as well-born children in Renaissance Florence could not have held a candle to growing up within aromatic range of Tabachnik's pickle barrels? Am I mistaken that even back then, in the vivid present, the fullness of life stirred our emotions to an extraordinary extent? Has anywhere since so engrossed you in its ocean of details? The detail, the immensity of the detail, the force of the detail, the weight of the detail, the rich endlessness of detail surrounding you in your young life, like the 6 feet of dirt that'll be packed on your grave when you're dead. Philip spent his final 3 weeks in the cardiac intensive care unit at New York Presbyterian Hospital. A lot of women and a smattering of men surrounded him. We were friends, lovers, protégés, relatives, employees, representing every decade of his adult life. And this I know for my part. When my own time comes, the waiting room will not be crowded with my ex-lovers. On the 21st day, the attending came out of Philip's room and said, "He is a philosopher, no?" "Yes," I said. And So it really was. Amid the general weeping, Philip was Socratic, as if instructing us, his loved ones, in how to die. He even remembered, like Socrates, a small debt owed to Mrs. Solano, his housekeeper. Near the end, he asked for a moment alone with me and said something I wrote down as soon as I decently could. I have been to see the great enemy and walked around him and talked to him, and he is not to be feared. I promise. There had been earlier brushes with the great enemy, any one of which might have proved fatal. One occurred on August 22nd, 2012. Canada geese were starting south. We'd gone to Litchfield for dinner and dressed up a bit for the occasion. Philip was in a sports jacket he claimed to have bought with the earnings from Goodbye Columbus. It may nearly have been so. He cared nothing for clothes. Seated in our usual booth at the West Street Grill, we ordered the special soup, their gazpacho, sweet and crunchy, with the local beef steaks and cucumbers. I had a baseball question on the tip of my tongue. What was the name of the natural, the player shot by a lady stalker in a Chicago hotel room? He gave me an amused look that darkened into puzzlement, then fear. Then he pitched forward into the soup, unconscious. Too astounded for anything but composure, I summoned the management. Medics appeared almost immediately. As if by further magic, a stretcher sprang up from the floor to receive him, who, though all but comatose, was saying something, an attempt entirely characteristic at telling the medics how to do their job. Moments later, I was in the front seat of the ambulance beside the driver with Philip and the two medics behind us. Thready pulse, said one to the other, and then to the driver, better turn on the siren. I thought, here is how it ends, and considered whom I would contact first. Thomas Mann's Aschenbach and the last line of Death in Venice came to mind, proving literature matters even in an emergency. Before nightfall, writes Mann, a shocked and respectful world received the news of his decease. Philip had equipped several of us with detailed instructions on how every aspect of his burial and memorial service should be handled. My mind veered to these. 20 minutes after our arrival at Charlotte Hungerford Hospital in Torrington, the ER physician explained that what Philip had suffered was an accumulated reaction to one of the drugs he'd been taking. When I entered the examining room, Philip said, "No more books." At first, I didn't know what he meant. What he meant, I shortly realized, was that Nemesis, his 31st, published 2 years earlier, would be his last. Thus, he announced his retirement. Well, I'll let it go at that.
Thank you so much, Ben. I have to say that he had a vexed relationship in discovering his own biographer, which he was unable to do in his lifetime. And I think he would be really chuffed, like they say in New Zealand, to know that this memory of your friendship with him has been published and has revealed him in all of his dimensions.
Actually, there is an authorized biographer with whom he had very fruitful relations, Blake Bailey, and I think that book will be out next year or the year after. I think maybe next year. I'm in close touch with 3 different biographers, so there's no shortage of books on the way about Philip. It's just that mine came to market first.
Well, that's always good, no? So tell us a little bit about, for those who haven't read the book, about how your friendship started and how it grew and how you were able to sustain it. Because one of the things that you told me is that he had difficulty sustaining friendships among equals.
Oh, well, but we weren't equals. I mean, he certainly had difficulty sustaining friendship with Harold Pinter or with Milan Kundera or indeed with John Updike. He and I sustained our friendship just fine. And it began, let's see, in the fall of 1994, we met. And then a few years after that, I read The Galleys of I Married a Communist and was moved to write him a letter. A few days later, the telephone rang, and it was Philip wanting to talk about what I'd said in my letter. And that was how it began. Our friendship was telephonic at first, and then I moved back to New York full time. And Philip was spending more time in New York, and our apartments were almost walking distance. I on 57th Street, he on 79th. And it developed quite naturally from there. Long walks, intimate talks, dinners, lunches, and once he took to email, there was no stopping him. He wanted to email every day.
What comes across in your memoir is a real tenderness and generosity, which doesn't underscore his ferocity and his intelligence and his delight in vengeance. It seems like to the end of his life, he never forgot a slight and basically got his revenge oftentimes in his fiction.
Well, that's true. Certain figures who became enemies, including his first wife and his second also became inveterate targets in the fiction, as if he was trying to exercise something. And all his emotions were outsized, as I said to him once. There was really just too much of him. He said, I've written in order not to die of those emotions.
And he was able to definitely exercise all of those emotions. Was he happy? One of the questions I had was a number of his books were turned into film. Or was he ever happy with any of the renditions of his works?
I think the filmed version he thought was most successful was a little made-for-TV version of The Ghostwriter, starring Claire Bloom as Mrs. Lonoff.
And were they married at that time when she portrayed Mrs. Lonoff?
They were attached, not married.
At the time. So tell me, what do you think is the most misunderstood characteristic of your friend?
Well, he was underneath all that crust. He was a terrible softy and tender and loving, and in many ways, the boy he was, the extremely high-spirited, mischievous boy, coexisted with the rather monumental man he became. It's just that when you lived at close quarters with him, the boy predominated.
And that was one of the things I didn't really investigate or know was that his childhood was very happy. And, as writers, that's so unusual.
Oh, this isn't, yes, a happy childhood isn't the best prognosticator for literary genius. That's true. But this was not something posited ex post facto. He really did have a remarkably well-balanced family life, and he loved that neighborhood, the Weequahic section. He loved Chancellor Avenue School and Weequahic High School. He loved the guys up and down the block. And I think that as for trauma, well, such family arguments, and I think there may have been a total of 6 bad arguments under that roof, had to do with his father's protectiveness, his father's awareness of the bad things out there in the world that he thought his boys weren't prepared for, the bad things that could happen, the bad things in particular that sex could do to a boy.
Mm-hmm. And that obviously, one of the things that I learned was that Gershom Scholem, the great Jewish philosopher, said about Portnoy's complaint that it was the most anti-Semitic, it was worse than the Protocols of the Elders of Zion.
Yes, can you imagine writing about such a jolly, harmless book, that it was worse than the Protocols of the Elders of Zion? I think that wasn't Gershom Scholem's most glorious day.
People, I mean, I'm old enough to remember when that book came out and how it was passed among us in junior high school, and everybody like would go to the specific pages. It was about the same time as The Godfather. And it was really kind of extraordinary when it first came out, in its, you know, in its explicitness and its wildness, actually, and its sheer libido. And now it's almost like if you don't write like that, then nobody wants to read you. But at that time, it was so extraordinarily revolutionary.
Yes, it did break down a lot of barriers. There were other books at the same moment that were doing the same thing. In the same year, I guess it was, John Updike's Couples and Norman Mailer's Why Are We in Vietnam? And Gore Vidal's Myra Breckenridge. These were all books that were taking advantage of a new liberty. Those were books that could not have been published in the early 60s, but could be published by the late 60s, one measure of the change in mores that that decade brought about. And of all those books, I think it's Philip's that is still the most read. He said, I wanted to answer the abominations of my time, assassinations, cities on fire, the daily, weekly death count from Southeast Asia. I wanted to answer these obscenities, world historical obscenities, with harmless obscenities of my own. And so it was a book very rooted in its tumultuous moment.
And it was, and it still has that same effect today. I mean, I think it's really an extraordinary work. How did he view that work towards the end of his life, considering the masterpieces that came in the last period of his writing career?
Oh, he felt about Portnoy's complaint that it had made him too famous and had determined too much of the course of the rest of his life. And I think it made him cringe. It wasn't a book he was particularly proud of. He regarded it in the best mood. He would regard it as a kind of early herald or precursor of Sabbath Theater, a book he was enormously proud of, that really puts Portnoy's complaint to shame in its explicitness.
And one of the things that I thought, his family, his Newark family, they were so worried about the shame he was going to bring upon them. And did the rabbi come and try to convince him not to publish like he did in The Ghostwriter? Because that's one moment in that book that really had a profound effect on me.
Oh, well, I think there was a local rabbi. I'm trying to remember the details of that. What wounded him to the quick was not after Portnoy, but even earlier, after the appearance of Defender of the Faith in the New Yorker. Rabbis in their pulpits would say, is anything being done to silence this man? That kind of thing certainly spooked him, and he wasn't ready for it and hadn't anticipated it. And it was certainly nothing Saul Bellow had remotely experienced in his career. No one ever dreamed of calling Saul Bellow an anti-Semite or somebody who'd written something to compare to the protocols of the elders of Zion. So this was something that had not happened to Bellow, still less had it happened to Malamud, but it did happen to Roth.
Talk a little bit about his relationship with Roth and Malamud. Was Malamud the figure that was this sort of the example for the mentor he visits in The Ghostwriter? I don't know if writers ever sort of say that that's who it is or not.
Yes, there's not a one-for-one correspondence, though he certainly was impressed by a visit he made to the Malamuds and a breakfast. It was Bernard Malamud who said to his wife at breakfast, she said, will you have an egg, Bern? And he said, well, no. She said, oh, have an egg, Bern. And he said, I'll have half an egg. I think that makes it into Lonoff's character. But he also was terrifically influenced by the life and self-dedication. And
Upa, there's Fran Blake. I don't know who she is.
hello, Fran Blake.
Hi, there we go. Okay.
By the example, the artistic example of Philip Guston. And so I think there's some of Malamud, but there's also some of Guston. And also I think he might have been wondering what his life would have been if he'd stayed up in Woodstock. So I think, as is the case with fiction writers, a lot of different things from real life got put into the centrifuge, and fiction was the distillate that came out.
And he was friendly with Bellow. I mean, they were healthily competitive, I would think, but they were also friendly.
Well, they were a generation apart. I don't think that, I think that Bellow felt a growing admiration for Philip. I don't think Bellow admired the early books particularly. He really began to take note of Philip with probably with The Counterlight, certainly with Operation Shylock, and he was a great admirer of Sabbath Theater and American Pastoral. The one book he didn't like was I Married a Communist, but they managed not to have the falling out that Philip did have with Updike and with Pinter and with Kundera too.
Why did those falling outs happen?
Well, those men, as you say, were his equals and every bit as touchy as he was. It was Malamud's. I mean, it was Pinter's ferocious anti-Americanism that finally couldn't bear. As for Updike, I think he had trouble forgiving Updike for a review of Operation Shylock, and as for Kundera, there was some perceived slight. I can't even remember what it was. I suspect it wasn't very important.
One of the things I'm always reminding people of, especially younger writers, is that Philip Roth was instrumental in bringing a lot of those Eastern European writers to an American audience. When he edited the Penguin Eastern European series, I mean, I still have my copy of Bruno Schultz's The Streets of Crocodiles. Milan Kundera's, I think, first book was published in that series. He was really extraordinarily generous as an editor as well as a writer. And I think that's something that people don't think about when they think about him as a writer.
Yes, it was my recently retired publisher, Catherine Court, who was responsible for seeing through the writers from the other Europe, as that series was called. And I think it was very important to Philip's career. It was a tremendous expansion. He hadn't known much about East Central Europe before, and in the course of the 70s, educated himself in a very aggressive way and spent a lot of time in Prague, particularly. It was any charge that he was a parochial writer died in those years because of his great services to literature in those Cold War years.
Tremendous. There are two things that we have to talk about when we talk about Roth, and one of them is his relationship with women. His two marriages affected him tremendously. One of the things I think also people don't talk about that much is he was a phenomenal memoirist. Both The Facts and Patrimony were amazing memoirs, incredibly eviscerating, and also very, very, very frank. I mean, he was very honest about himself and the consequences of his first marriage, and then also the devastation of his second marriage. And I think that his relationship with women, would you say, has been misconstrued? It's very complex. I think he's a very complex figure.
Well, I've never understood the oppositeness of this term misogyny, which means hatred of women. Philip preferred the company of women to the company of men, decidedly. And as I say, in that waiting room, as he lay dying, it was mostly women, and women from all phases of his life, going back to when he was in his 20s. So I've really never understood that. And some of the most memorable characters he created in his books are women. Take just as one exceptional example, Mrs. Roth in The Plot Against America.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody said to me, the women in his books lack agency. This is a cant phrase. I don't have much use for it. But Mrs. Roth in The Plot Against America lacks agency. I don't see that at all.
One of the things you say, and you attribute to him, is that writers often invent truth that then comes to bear, that then happens. And I think it's really seminal right now to talk about The Plot Against America in terms of its prescience. And one of the curiosities I have is, he knew Trump. What would he have thought, of this pandemic? How would it have affected his writing? And would he believe that America could recover from what it's going through right now with the Trump administration?
Yes, well, Philip had the imagination of disaster, never better on display than in his later books, like American Pastoral.
Mm-hmm.
A girl who blows up a post office
Mm-hmm.
in the name of virtue, and the Human Stain, which culminates in a murder.
Mm-hmm.
I'm so upset. I can hear it, but
I can't.
And The Plot Against America, which is about a proto-fascist regime in the United States. So I think this chapter we're now living through would have actuated him if he were still in his writing years. His way of coping with any kind of embattlement was to go to the yellow pad and then go to the typewriter, even if he wasn't writing something that was going to be part of a work of fiction. He was constantly writing, and in fact, he continued to be a writer after his retirement, after his supposed retirement from writing. He didn't stop writing. He went on writing for himself. Writing was his way of figuring out what was happening. So we would have had pages from Philip Roth on what is happening to us. Yes, definitely.
Did he leave any notes to be opened later on in trust? Who is his literary executor?
His literary executors are Julia Gollier and Andrew Wiley, and I don't believe that there is anything that is sealed at the Library of Congress that is subsequently to be unsealed. The Library of Congress has a rule about this, and his entire bequest to the Library of Congress is now available to scholars, and I gather they are, well, while the library was still open, they were constantly in and out.
Did you consult any of his letters before writing your memoir, or was it something you just did from your own memories?
I was writing a memoir, not a biographical sketch, but a memoir in which my own memory was the be all and the end all, and I consulted only myself. I did take some pains to get names and dates and places right, to get the factual armature right, but mostly I wanted to portray a friendship, and I felt that for such a book to be worth anything at all, it would have to be completely frank. But that's my view about the other two memoirs that preceded this one. I've written a trilogy of memoirs, I see now. Naples Declared, which is a book about a city, The Hue and Cry at Our House, which is a book about a family. And now this, here we are, a book about a friendship. In each case, I felt that any reticence or falsification or prettification would spoil the stew. So that's my view on memoir. When I was young, my interest was in novels, and I felt that the novel was the big game, and the more inventive, the better. But along about the end of middle age, maybe this was an indication that I was reaching the end of middle age, it occurred to me that it might be enough of a task just to try to say what actually happened. And that was the birth of me as a memoirist.
Was he interested in your work? Would he read your work?
He read everything I wrote. Oh, sure.
And what kind of a critic was he? Or was he a critic at all?
It was brutal. In my archive at Princeton, there is the first draft of the Hue and Cry at Our House with Philip's murderous on nearly every page. It was nothing if not thorough.
Well, that's a true friend, actually, I think.
He would write, "Then are you out of your mind?"
He comes across as extremely, almost like Old Testament prophetic, but also very funny and also very tender. Could you share a moment of humor that you think, would indicate something special about him to people who wouldn't know him?
Well, by a kind of fiendish irony, on the grounds of the Museum of Natural History, there is a monument just steps from Philip's New York doorstep. A monument to all the American winners of the Nobel Prize. One day, Philip and I were examining this monument, and a lady scurried up to us and looked up at Philip, screwed up her face and said, "Looking for your name? It's not there." He just laughed.
Well, he had a good sense of humor.
And about himself too, yes.
When do you miss him most?
When there's something funny to report.
Mm-hmm. So did you have that kind of relationship where he would be the first one you would, tell about something humorous?
Yes, and that's chiefly what he used the telephone for.
Mm-hmm.
Laughs.
And how have you felt about the reception for Here We Are? Have you been pleased with it? And
Sure.
It's a beautiful book too. They did it physically, a beautiful book.
They did. My thanks to everyone at Penguin who have been superb. There was one review in England that made me wonder if there's anything people won't scribble down against a deadline, that I had arranged liaisons with women for Philip. Does that seem remotely plausible?
No.
The, I hope, very young reviewer who wrote it.
But obviously they didn't read it. Do you know what I mean? So a lot of the times people come to these conclusions. I mean, my feeling about a lot of the young people that I talk to in book selling and teaching, they have developed opinions about Roth without having read him.
Oh, yes, that is certainly true.
And I think that, I always point to Goodbye Columbus, which is like the first book I read. It's also one of the books, like when I work in McNally Jackson and some foreigners come in and they want a book to read about American life that's funny, that's not too difficult. I always say Goodbye Columbus, which is such absolutely a wonderful book. But he's such a terrific writer, and it really incenses me when people come to this conclusion about him as a writer without having ever read him.
That's true. I have discovered that among certain students, but when they discover, I've had a lot of students, many of them female students, come to me and say, I had the wrong idea about this writer. I think Philip has had a bum rap from the Academy.
Which books do you tell your students to read if they want to read Roth?
Well, for me, the greatest of them all is The Human Stain. I think that's the book in which he goes most deeply into the American grain. And it's the book that's most revealing on the subject of race, on the subject of aspiration of the great American story, which is making oneself up from scratch. He's never more powerful than in the pages of The Human Stain.
And I like American Pastoral. I think that is also an extraordinary work.
In that book, he, having written Sabbath Theater about somebody, about his dirtiest hero, Mickey Sabbath, he resolved to invent a hero who was as clean as Mickey had been dirty. And that's the story of wholesome, law-abiding Swede Lvov, whose virtue does nothing to protect him when the blindsiding force of history comes to call.
Did he read his reviews or no? I know he really, another person he could not stand was Kakutani, who he kept on eviscerating later in his writing life, who was the premier critic for the New York Times for many years.
I certainly think he read everything that was written about him, and he read all the books that were written about him. So yes, he may have affected to be above these, but there are very few writers who don't read their own reviews.
They lie if they say they don't. I don't think Jim Lahiri does. That's really the only one that I know.
That's more character than I possess. I'm up in the nights seeing what people say. So.
Do you think he had any regrets towards the end of his life?
He'd like to quote a famous boxer. Was it Joe Louis? I did the best I could with what I had.
Mm-hmm.
Quoting that, I don't think he had regrets. I think he did with his life everything he meant to do, and some things he hadn't meant to do. He hadn't really meant to become notorious. He wanted to be among the admired young writers. He became the most notorious writer of his generation.
It's true. That's true.
That wasn't part of the plan.
But he was also fiercely strong for getting the rewards of his writing. I think he was one of the first writers to really take his career in hand. I think that he changed agents at one point, or changed houses at a point in order to get more control over his work. So he was really all the time, he was very much in control of his career. And he set an example for writers to come after him.
There were several changes of publisher along the way. He left Farrar Straus and went to Simon & Schuster. And then he left Simon & Schuster and went to Houghton Mifflin, which is where he had started with Goodbye Columbus at Houghton Mifflin. And I believe there was one agent, and then no agent, and then another. But these were always anguished decisions. I think he had he was an arts professional, and he was intent on protecting his work, which was not a commodity to him. It belonged to art. My
last question before I turn it over to John is, we know that he admired many male writers. Were there any women writers who he also admired on the same level?
Yes, he considered Louise Erdrich the greatest writer of our generation, and
that's wonderful to know.
And admired her tremendously.
That's great. That's really wonderful to know. That makes me very happy. John, do we have any questions from our audience?
Sort of related to that question, Barry asks, who did Roth consider his primary literary influences?
Yes, well, I think as a young man, he saw himself as the child of Henry James. Then he uh, then he read Celine, and that convinced him that he was not a Mandarin, but a raucous talent. And Celine, very important. And Bello, as a young man in 53, I guess, when The Adventures of Augie March came out, he read it and, like everyone, was bowled away by the power of that book. It just blew the doors off American writing. It was something so fresh. And I think you have a whole generation of writers who are one way and another the children of Augie, and one of those.
Do you think, Ben, that he went to University of Chicago because of the Bellow influence, or there were so many, young American male novelists coming out of Chicago at that time?
Yes, well, I think that was the mid-50s, and I don't think that Bello was teaching. He didn't have a regular appointment at the University of Chicago until the 60s, I think. Early 60s. Though it was at the University of Chicago in Richard Stern's writing class that he first met Bello. And Bello read his early story, Philip's early story, The Conversion of the Jews. So, the University of Chicago, you spend some time there, it has a tremendous mystique. And people felt that while certain East Coast universities had a social cachet, the deepest intellectual seriousness was in Hyde Park. And Philip felt that it was a great awakening for him when he went to U of C.
And he was only 16 when he started.
No. He went first to University of New Jersey at Newark, and then transferred to Bucknell. He graduated at Bucknell and then went on to the University of Chicago.
Okay, I got that wrong. Thank you for correcting me. Anything else, John? Do you have any other questions?
I have a question about the writing of the book and whether, the Mary Carr blurb mentions Boswell and Johnson, and there are examples of memoirs of literary friendship. Maybe Just Kids would count. I really like Alison Lurie's book Familiar Spirits about her friendship with James Merrill. And I wondered if there were any books that you consulted as examples of something that you were trying to accomplish with Here We Are, or whether you just put pen to paper and
Well, the model I had was one of Philip's own books, Patrimony. And that was for me the standout. As for Boswell, it's embarrassing to be mentioned in the greatest of all literary biographers. Boswell's Life of Johnson is a great big multi-volume work. My own is a little book of under 200 pages. Let's keep things in proportion. James Boswell.
Did Roth ever teach?
Oh yes, he was quite a good teacher and dedicated teacher. He first started teaching at the University of Chicago as a young man in a three-piece Brooks Brothers suit bought for the occasion, and he taught, let's see, for years at the University of Pennsylvania, and then at Hunter, and then at that point. I think he stopped teaching. I think he stopped teaching when he was about 60.
One of the guests said that he also taught at Bard.
Yes, he did teach at Bard. That was the last of his teaching gestures.
Mm-hmm.
You know if he enjoyed teaching?
I think he enjoyed teaching very much.
Because your story of writing a letter and developing the friendship, teaching is complicated too, but it's also a great source of community, and it's a place to find mentors or mentees. And I wondered if what happened with you, a letter leading to a friendship, was something that was characteristic in his life.
Oh, Very, very. Also was characteristic of him was a certain didactic zeal when he got going. A friend and I used to call his house up in Connecticut the Roth University, because you were given books to read. He would sit you down and have you watch certain movies he wanted you to see. And somebody said to me, was Philip really that articulate? Could anybody really be that articulate? It's the first book. Well, the answer is yes. Yes.
Another question. Do you know anything? Can you speak anything about his relationship with the Romanian writer, Norman Manea?
Oh, yes. Well, that was a great friendship. And Philip was responsible for bringing Norman and Cella Magna to America and establishing them at Bard College. And Norman was a great friend and a heroic figure, a survivor both of Nazism and of communism.
Mm-hmm.
And what you said earlier about seeing now that what you've written is a trilogy of memoirs, did that only occur to you after having finished it, or was part of your motivation in writing Here We Are to complete a trilogy that you had discovered?
It came to me in the early stages of writing Here We Are that I was forging a slightly new style, but that had a family resemblance to the style of The Hue and Cry and the style of Naples Declared. In each case, the style wasn't a suit of clothes I picked beforehand. The style was the end result of my struggles with what I had to say. But the books do mark an epoch in my working life, and I think of them together.
Ben, what are you working on now?
Well, I'm sort of dreaming up a new book. I wrote a biography of Proust a few years back and and had a marvelous time. And I'm hankering to be a biographer again, to have one more go at that. And I think I'd like to do a writer who is preeminent for me among Americans, Willa Cather.
Oh, that'd be wonderful. Anything else? I think that's about it. No? Do we have any more time?
I don't see any other questions in the chat. Do you have any last questions, Cheryl?
I think that just to say, everyone I know who's read Here We Are has been really taken by it. It's a book that stays with you. It's about a writer's life, but the impact the life has on others. And it is really a 360-degree portrait with all the pimples and all the joys. And it's a lovely, lovely read, and something that could give you a lot of solace and hope during this crazy time. So I thank Ben for giving us the opportunity to talk to him today, and for writing this wonderful book about a writer who's one of my personal heroes.
Thank you, Cheryl, and thank you, John, very much.
Of course. Thank you for letting us host you, and thank you to everybody for watching. You can go to McNallyJackson.com and see who else we're hosting soon. There's a link to buy a copy of Ben's book from us in the chat. But this was just really lovely. Thank you for letting us host you.
Thank you all for being here. Hello, Kathy Horrigan. I see your name here.
Okay. Well, okay.